when we talk about a universal minimum wage, it's essential to first understand what this means and why it's such a significant topic in today's world. Imagine a system where no matter where someone lives, whether it's a highly developed country like Germany or a developing nation like Kenya, they are guaranteed a baseline income that ensures their basic needs are met. The idea behind a universal minimum wage is to create fairness and dignity for workers globally, giving everyone a shot at a better quality of life. One of the main arguments in favor of implementing a universal minimum wage is that it could significantly reduce global poverty. In many countries, especially those with developing economies, wages are so low that even full-time workers struggle to afford essential items like food, housing, and healthcare. A universal minimum wage could change this, helping millions of people live with more security. For instance, in countries like Bangladesh, where the garment industry is a major employer but pays notoriously low wages, a universal baseline could ensure workers earn enough to support themselves and their families more comfortably. This would mean fewer children going to bed hungry and more families being able to afford basic healthcare services. Another benefit of this concept is that it could improve global living standards and create more balance in economic development between countries. By having a standard minimum wage, people across the globe could have a more equitable income, which would help shrink the gap between rich and poor countries. For example, a factory worker in Vietnam could earn closer to what their counterpart in a wealthier nation might make, leading to a fairer distribution of wealth. Over time, this could promote better global economic stability, as more people with disposable income could drive demand for goods and services. On the other side of the discussion, we need to consider some potential challenges and criticisms. One significant issue is that the economic situation varies greatly from one country to another. What works as a fair minimum wage in the United States or France might be completely unsustainable in a country like Uganda, where the cost of living and economic conditions are different. If wages were raised too high too quickly, businesses, especially small and medium enterprises, might struggle to stay afloat. For instance, in rural areas of countries with fragile economies, employers could be forced to lay off workers or close down operations entirely if they are unable to pay the new mandated wages. This could lead to an increase in unemployment, which is counterproductive to the original goal of reducing poverty. Inflation is another concern. If every country implemented a universal minimum wage, businesses might pass the increased labor costs onto consumers by raising prices. This could result in inflation, where the cost of goods and services rises, potentially offsetting the benefits of higher wages. A higher cost of living without a corresponding increase in economic productivity could mean that the purchasing power of the wage is diminished, and the initial goal of improving living standards might not be fully realized. Countries like Venezuela, which have faced hyperinflation due to sudden economic changes, show how fragile the balance can be between wages and prices. Small businesses would also face unique challenges in adjusting to these changes, while large multinational corporations might have the resources to manage higher wages. Smaller local businesses, especially those in developing nations, might not be as equipped. This could force them to make tough choices, such as cutting down their workforce or reducing business hours to manage expenses. Picture a small grocery store in a rural town trying to cope with paying its employees a higher wage. It might not have the profit margin to support such a shift without significant consequences. Despite these drawbacks, advocates of a universal minimum wage believe that the potential long-term benefits outweigh the short-term challenges. Ensuring a basic level of income across the world could help reduce the exploitation of workers, especially in industries that rely heavily on cheap labor. Multinational corporations often set up operations in countries where wages are low to maximize profits. A universal minimum wage would mean these companies must pay fairer wages, which would contribute to better working conditions and economic equity. There are also broader, non-financial impacts to consider. With higher wages, workers could access better education and training, leading to a more skilled workforce. This could create a positive cycle where higher wages result in more education, which then leads to better job opportunities and economic growth. In the long term, countries could see a decline in issues such as child labor and poor working conditions, as families wouldn't need to rely on their children contributing to household income as much. But the question remains, how would a universal minimum wage be implemented? This is one of the most difficult aspects of the concept. A major challenge is agreeing on what the baseline wage should be. Economic experts would need to consider the living costs and economic capabilities of each country, potentially leading to regional variations rather than a single global rate. For example, a minimum wage in Switzerland, where the cost of living is high, would need to be much higher than in Nepal. The process would require international cooperation, detailed data analysis, and possibly a new regulatory body to ensure compliance and enforcement across borders. Currency fluctuations add another layer of complexity. If a universal minimum wage is pegged in a single currency, such as the US dollar, sudden changes in exchange rates could impact how effective the wage is in different countries. For instance, if a country's currency loses value against the dollar, the real value of the wage would drop, making it harder for workers to make ends meet. This would require mechanisms to adjust the wage periodically or regional standards that account for currency differences. Enforcing a universal minimum wage would also be a monumental task. Ensuring that every country follows the guidelines would likely require international agreements, possibly backed by organizations like the United Nations or the International Labour Organization. There would also need to be monitoring and consequences for countries or companies that fail to comply, which could be politically sensitive. The idea of a universal minimum wage is, therefore, both ambitious and fraught with challenges. It holds the promise of lifting millions out of poverty, improving working conditions, and promoting global economic fairness. However, it also comes with risks, including potential unemployment spikes, inflation, and difficulties in implementation. The key might lie in finding a middle ground, such as regional or sector-specific minimum wages that consider local economic conditions while still aiming for broader fairness. Ultimately, achieving a more just world where everyone can live with dignity will require careful planning, global cooperation, and a shared commitment to both economic growth and social welfare.